Japan is one of the most popular tourist destinations in the world. Each year, tens of millions of people pass through its largest airport. A visitor might wonder that in the middle of all the machinery, asphalt, and throngs of travelers, there are a few tiny farms. They might not be there for much longer, but more on that later. The airport serves the Tokyo area, but it isn't named after Tokyo, because it's not there. It's dozens of miles away in a formerly small farming village called Narita, which is where the airport gets its name. Resistance of locals to the demolition of their villages and the appropriation of their land to create the airport would lead to decades of violent clashes. The Sanrizuka struggle, or Sanrizuka Toso, named for the small hamlet Sanrizuka in the Narita area where the conflict was centered, was a savage tapestry woven from many threads. Poor farmers, student movements, modernization, 1960s radicalism, capitalism, and so-called progress. To learn more, I visited the Narita Airport Community Historical Museum. Displays at the museum describe this era in English as Days of Confrontation, but the Japanese reads Ryoketsu no Hibi, the Days of Bloodshed. So what happened? Before the construction of the airport, the area of Narita had been farmland for over 1,000 years. After World War II, portions which had been owned by the imperial family were sold off to farmers. These farmers performed heavy agricultural labor, often without electricity or running water. They were called Shinkyumin, or the New Poor. Despite their material poverty, they were proud of their connection to the land, and it was a central part of their identity. They didn't know, but their lives were about to change forever.
Time is relative. Out here, it hurtles by at nearly the speed of sound.
By the 1960s, Japan was a booming modern nation. Both symbolically and in real terms, commercial aviation was inexorably linked to this economic development. Tokyo already had an airport at Haneda, but it was too small and didn't have space to expand. The government sought a new location for a new airport that would be a flagship of the new Japan. An initial spot for the airport was chosen, but already met with opposition, a sign of things to come. In response, in 1966, the government secretly decided to move the planned airport to a different location, the small village of Sanrizuka in the Narita area. The residents were not informed, but instead they found out their homes and farms would be taken during an official press conference by the Prime Minister. Obviously, the residents of the area were angry. They organized together to protect their community. The group was called the Sanrizuka芝山連合空港反対同盟, which was shortened to Hantai Dome or Opposition Alliance. The farmers joined with leftist groups, socialists, communists, as well as student activists. Like the USA, England, and countries across the world, Japan had a huge youth counterculture in the 1960s. In this case, the youth groups and leftists made common cause with the older and often conservative farmers. It would become the longest-running social movement in the history of Japan.
Is he prepared to defend this stockade, even at the risk of violence and people being killed?
暴力があってもね、やっぱりまだいつまでもね、戦うつもりですから。暴力があっても、
あくまでも戦う。
あくまでも。
どこまでも戦う。
Yeah, we'll fight right to the end, even if there is violence. The struggle will continue.
A man named Isaku Tomura emerged as one of the main leaders of the anti-airport union. Born in Sanrizuka in 1909, he was a young man during the rise of fascism and Japan's entry into World War II. A fierce opponent of the war, he was drafted into the Imperial Japanese Army in 1943, but was immediately cast out due to his anti-war stance. In the turbulent decades after the war, he was involved in several protest movements. A devout Christian, his commitment to social justice causes was part of a deeply held ethical and religious stance. Now, with the airport looming over the small village where he was born, the fight had come to his doorstep. When no leader stepped forward to guide the nascent movement, he said he would volunteer for a short time until, quote, someone better is found, unquote. He would go on to lead the movement for many years, becoming its beating heart and soul.
In Japan, a left-wing demonstrator leads a crowd of supporters in a clamorous protest. The audience is made up of farmers and students. On the face of it, an unlikely alliance.
People began to express their opposition to the airport with peaceful demonstrations and sit-ins. The entire community, from children to the elderly, would be involved in protest actions. Though it soon became clear that these would be ignored by the government, who was determined to trample over any objection to creating the airport. Their words falling on deaf ears, opponents resorted to more extreme measures. The farmers and their allies organized militant groups which blocked roads, destroyed construction materials, and occupied locations. They created fortified ramparts around their farms to prevent them from being stolen. They would fight with bamboo spears and throw Molotov cocktails at police. Police would arrest and beat protesters, break their bones, shoot rubber bullets and fire hoses. People would die on both sides. Through the late 1960s and into the 1970s, violence escalated back and forth through constant protests and police crackdowns. By 1971, the government was eager to sweep aside the protests once and for all and begin construction on the airport. They began a final push to appropriate the land from the farmers. The Hantai Dome organized thousands to resist with force. A huge and violent battle occurred between the protesters and the police. It was the worst rioting in Japan since World War II. 3 police officers were killed and countless people were injured on both sides. 4 days later, another infamous incident occurred. Koizumi Yone was an elderly woman who, like many, had refused to give up her land for the construction of the airport. While she was working in the field, she was approached by police. They beat her, breaking her teeth, and dragged her away. They destroyed her house, leaving nothing behind. The image of a lone old woman bravely facing state repression became a symbol which galvanized resistance to the airport. The following year, in 1972, the protesters took a step to block the airport, literally. They constructed a giant tower from concrete and steel, meant to impede the flight path of the airplanes, making newly constructed runway useless.
The climax of a decade's dispute is now approaching. At least 30 demonstrators plan to cling to the tower as it's brought down, a final, almost certainly suicidal act of defiance, but one it seems the government will have to accept as the final payment for Narita International.
By the late 1970s, the airport had still not opened. Resistance had delayed completion, but ultimately the result seemed inevitable. In 1978, there were only days until the airport was planned to be opened. Riot police came to take down the steel tower, and thousands of protesters clashed with them. But this was a mere distraction. Something else was happening underground. Activists used sewers beneath the airport to sneak into the airport control tower itself, smashing machinery and hanging signs. While being a dramatic victory for their cause, it was also the high water mark from which the wave would break and roll back. Despite all their efforts, later that year the airport was officially open for business. The leader of the resistance, Tomura, passed away the next year in 1979. Either through coercion or by being bought off, many of the farmers gave up. Infighting began between the various left-wing factions that alienated supporters. Resistance continued, however, and between 1979 and 2017, 511 separate guerrilla actions were taken against the airport according to police. The 1980s saw more fierce battles as efforts were made to expand the airport. Yet, over these next decades, the movement slowly dwindled away. In 2023, one of the very last farmers, a man named Takao Shito, was evicted from a significant portion of his land.
今の状況をここからどういう気持ちでご覧になってますか？
いやまあ残念だったけどね、こういう形になってね、まあ取られた分であるものでね、その農家をやっていくっていう。
The remains of the tower built to block the runway were still there when I visited in 2024. It was decaying, rusty, overgrown with vines, and infested with snakes. A perfect monument to the heroic, stubborn, inspirational, yet doomed lost cause of the people who fought so hard to protect this land.